When we have ADHD, we're so good at putting ourselves down and feeling bad about ourselves. But when we spend all this time trying to make up for things that we're not good at, we're missing out on all the benefits of the things that we are good at, which are not only more enjoyable to spend time doing, but also the places that we're actually gonna find ultimate success. Hello and welcome to Through the Noise Coaching. My name is Lee and I'm a leadership coach specialising in growing the careers of mid to senior neurospices. I have ADHD myself, so this is a trap that I fall into myself. Definitely spend too much time thinking about what I'm not good at, when really the thing that people value me for is the stuff that I am good at. So I try and spend as much of my time in that world as possible, building on my strengths because my strengths are what take me forward. I'd also like to call myself ADHD neutral. I definitely have days where I struggle with executive function and emotional dysregulation is really a wild ride for me. But also, ADHD is the reason why I became an entrepreneur. It's the reason why I play 3 instruments to a good standard instead of one to an amazing standard, and all these good things that come to my life from having ADHD. I wouldn't go as far as calling it a superpower because I think that makes the people that are having a bad period feel even worse about their own ADHD. What I would say is that despite its struggles, ADHD has some good sides as well, and we need to acknowledge both of those sides. So I like to talk about them. I have a previous video all about ADHD strengths, which I'll link up above, that talks about some of the strengths of ADHD that you may or may not have. But that's actually not the topic of today, because today I'm going to talk about how to find your personal strengths, ones that may or may not be touched by your ADHD, and go into what I think we maybe can call your personal superpowers in this case. So the resource I want to talk about is one that I use with my clients all the time. It is a paid resource, but I don't have any affiliate link or anything. I don't get any kickback for making this video. The only reason I'm sharing it is because I've found it's really helpful with my ADHD clients to understand what they're good at and to be able to use it instead of getting stuck in this negative mindset. So I'm going to talk you through it. In order to get a Clifton Strengths report, you need to complete a Clifton Strengths Assessment, which is basically a questionnaire on their website, and you answer a series of questions that I think takes about 30 minutes, and in the end you get a report that is completely personalised to you based on your own personal strengths, based on how you've answered the questions. The science behind it is pretty robust, and they've actually found that people taking the tests spaced apart over a period of times tend to get broadly similar results, so it's not something you need to retake as things change in your life, unlike some personality tests which really don't have the same result, but I've spoken about that in a previous video. Now, I've actually used this report personally a number of times on various leadership courses and things like that, and when I first did the questionnaire myself and got my own report, this was long before I even suspected I might have ADHD. So my initial read-through of my Clifton Strengths report was completely detached from my ADHD or potential autism, and just a reading through as it relates to me as a person and my personality. Post-diagnosis though, I see my report a little bit differently. So I thought it might be an interesting activity today to kind of go through part of my report, explain what it is, explain how the whole thing works, but also look for what is and what isn't my neurodivergence and what is my personality and how they interplay in my Clifton Strengths. So Clifton Strengths is made up of 34 themes across 4 strategic domains. And so when you fill in the assessment, you'll be asked questions pertaining to all 34, and then it picks your 5 top and it puts them at the top of your report. Now, what's interesting about these 5 top strengths is they are your strengths, they're the places you perform better. But there's also the danger of those strengths becoming overplayed. Because in the Clifton Strengths world, we don't have weaknesses, we have strengths that are overplayed when we take our strengths too far to the point where they become a detriment to us. We can look at the example of competitiveness. Healthy competition can be a good thing. Some people are really motivated by a bit of competition to push themselves a little bit harder, to try even more, and can really achieve really great stuff when they have a bit of competition. However, it's really possible to take competitiveness too far. You can get it to the point where you just don't get any enjoyment out of things unless you're winning, and so a second place feels devastating. It can also make you a frankly horrible person to be around if you turn everything in life into a competition. You can see how competitiveness can work as a strength, but also how it can be overplayed in this example and become effectively a weakness. When my clients receive the reports, they immediately seem to scroll down to the watch out for blind spots section, which is a part of each of these strengths where it kind of tackles the overplayed aspect of it. Isn't it just an amazing feature of ADHD that that's where our brains immediately go to? We have a whole page telling us why we're amazing, and we go read the part that says, be careful because this can go wrong straight away. But even if we do look at these overplayed, these are just when our strengths have gone too far. And what we can do is we can bring them back to a more reasonable level so they work to service us instead of against us. And so that's what I do with many of my clients. Work out what the strength looks like, recognize it in themselves so they know when it's servicing them and when it's becoming a little bit of a problem. The 34 themes are then broken down into 4 strategic domains, which groups together similar strengths that are broadly in the same domain. So those 4 strategic domains are executing, strategic thinking, relationship building, and influencing. What's kind of funny about that is I'd written the word executive instead of executing in my script because I'm used to talking about executive function all the time. So if we have more strength in strategic thinking, for example, that means that's what we gravitate to. So we tend to get things done using our strategic thinking more than anything else, which could have the same result as someone who is using their relationship building, for example, but just we go about it in a slightly different way. That also just doesn't mean we can't use the other strategic domains. It just means that we're stronger in the ones that have come up the most. The top 5 strengths are what's most important, so the stuff that comes up in our lives on a regular basis. It gives us the most detail on these, as well as some detail on strengths 6 to 10. It then tells us very briefly the remaining strengths for the total 34 and how we rank on all of them. Recently with a client, we went through the whole 34 so they could look at the ones that they weren't so good at. And they came to a realization. One is that the strengths they weren't so good at were because they were overplaying or perhaps leaned a lot more heavily on some of their top 5. For example, being super futuristic at the expense of contextualizing things in the past. The others were things that they could do, they just didn't show up that often. They were situational, not ones that they used as part of their everyday working life. Just because something comes at number 34 doesn't mean it's a weakness. My lowest strength actually, coming in at number 34, is empathy. And you might be thinking, how can a coach be someone who is not super strong at empathy? That doesn't make sense at all. But it's just that it shows up in a different way for me. See, the definition they use is to be able to sense other people's feelings by imagining themselves in others' lives or situations. But this just shows up differently for me, because maybe I don't put myself directly in their shoes and get in there. But actually maybe I use one of my top strengths, which is input, and that's about collecting and gathering information around me and taking in a lot of information to be able to form ideas about things. So perhaps I'm using the information that they're giving me to imagine what's going on in their shoes and using that to empathize with them instead of putting myself directly there. I understand people through what they tell me and contextualizing it in what I know about them and of life in general and my experiences coaching in general. I don't put myself into their shoes, which is something that if overplayed could end up with that person centering themselves instead of like being open to the person they're coaching. So I am empathetic, just not in the way that empathy works in that particular strength. So with that in mind, I thought it might be useful to take a look at my top 5 and see how my neurodivergent plays out there. So let's get into it. So looking at each of these top 5, we see the big block of text underneath, and that's actually personalized to you. So it's not like you get a standard block of text for each of these strengths. In fact, a close friend of mine both have one of our top 5 strengths in common, but the text underneath hers is actually completely different to the text underneath mine, which is really interesting. So the way that this futuristic strength shows up in my life is contextualized in amongst the other strengths that I have. When I look at the strength of futuristic on the whole, one of the things that actually comes up to me is the entrepreneurship, and in fact in the take action to maximize your potential section, it actually says that entrepreneurship might be a good fit for me. I'm not going to go into the relationship between ADHD and entrepreneurship because I just finished a whole 3-part video series on that, so if you like to have a watch of that, then click the link above. But it's really interesting because the first time I read this report, I actually didn't spot that. In fact, I'd been interested in becoming an entrepreneur way back when I was at university, but a friend told me he didn't think I'd be any good at it, and that put me off for years. And so when I first did the report, I just didn't take that in, I didn't notice it was on there. It wasn't until years later when I actually started working towards becoming an entrepreneur, and when I fully committed to the idea, that I saw it written there and found that incredibly interesting. A second point is I love how it highlights a high level of skill or specialist knowledge about certain subjects, because that to me reads as special interests and hyperfixations. Hyperfixations are absolutely my favourite part of ADHD. I find them so joyful. I feel lost when I don't have a hyperfixation, and I feel like they really enrich my life to have these bouts of obsessions over cool things that end up being just wonderful parts of my life. My hyperfixations and special interests have laid the foundation foundation to my life and allowed me to be successful off the back of them, and just brought me a lot of joy and enjoyment as well, which is valuable in itself. And certain aspects aren't necessarily my neurodivergence. Like, for example, the goal setting is very much a me thing, but also the point about building a future that I want to see. It's something I probably wouldn't have related to in the past, but now I feel like that's what I'm doing with this YouTube channel, with my coaching business, is I'm building a learning about neurodivergence and a different way of viewing neurodivergence that I really hope is going to change how people see neurodivergence in the future. When I move on to the blind spots, I think enjoying the present is something that many of us with ADHD struggle with when we have thousands of thoughts running through our mind at any one point in time. I've tried mindfulness a few times and I'm really bad at it. Now, you might be surprised to see that actually my second highest strength is one called focus. That doesn't sound like something an ADHD would be good at, but I'm not lying about my ADHD. And when we go into some of the text below, then actually become a bit more clearer why this is one of my strengths. It definitely ties into my futuristic strength on being forward-looking and taking action to move things forwards. It talks about goal setting and being driven, which is something that I definitely am. And even when I wrote this script, I thought that might not be ADHD or autism related, but I actually feel like achieving these goals gives me dopamine boosts, and that's potentially linked to my ADHD in its own particular flavour as well. But it's the third point that has my ADHD written all over it. It says that I dive deep into topics that interest me, and that to me says hyperfixation and special interest all over again. I see a theme emerging here. It talks about information gathering on topics that interest me, and how this information gathering is really useful because we can bring together different ideas from different domains and all of our learning to produce something amazing. This is why focus is a strength for my neurodivergent brain, not because I can just focus on anything and work ridiculously hard like a neurotypical would. It's there for the strength it has, not the drawback it sometimes is. And actually, funnily enough, in the blind spot section, it alludes to hyperfocus by saying not to get so caught up in the research that I just forget everything else going on, which, yeah, is fair enough. A lot of these themes continue in subsequent strengths. In Learner, it actually uses the term special interest, but I don't think it means it in an autistic way, but talks about bringing ideas from disparate areas together. I've always said this is an advantage of ADHD because we can bring together ideas from different places due to all of our hyperfixation. The second blind spot also feels very relevant. Don't get distracted away from important stuff because you're researching your special interest or hyperfixation. Noted. While my harmony strength doesn't immediately scream neurodivergence, I do note some points in there. Like, for example, it says I tend to be more accepting of others. And I feel like that's fairly common with neurodivergence because we've never fit in really. And so we're more likely to be accepting of people who don't fit in either. I also see references to emotional dysregulation and rejection sensitivity here, with comments that I prefer emotional balance, which my emotional dysregulation often means that I don't get. And also that I maybe wouldn't do so well in a super salesy role with lots of cold calling because it would set off my rejection sensitivity. We round out the top 5 with special interests and hyperfixations, again in input and its information gathering. And this really says to me that my strengths are related to the part of my neurodivergence that I love the most. This means that I gain the most value by focusing on things that I'm good at and that I enjoy it as well, instead of trying to manage the things that I'm bad at. I didn't want to dive too deeply into each of the top 5 because I didn't want to make this a video where I just tell you about me in some weird self-indulgent way. But I did want to give you a bit of an idea of how Clifton Strengths works and how you can use this as a tool to learn more about yourself. If this sounds like something that's interesting to you, you could head on over to Clifton Strengths to do the assessment yourself. Like I said, I don't get any kickback for this at all. I just really like the tool. And if you'd like help kind of analysing this and having some context of how this plays into your life and working through it with someone, then I can do coaching on these kind of topics all the time, and you can get in touch via the link in the description down below. That's it for this week. Like, comment and subscribe, and if you haven't seen them already, you might be interested in my video series on how ADHD relates to entrepreneurship. Thank you for your attention today, and I'll see you in the next one.